Margaret lived a quiet life, a life marked by routines so steady that they had become part of her identity. Every day was a mirror of the one before it, the soft hum of the kettle at 7 a.m., the shuffle of her slippers across the hardwood floor, and the comforting aroma of fresh brewed coffee that filled her modest home. Her house, a quaint single story with pale blue siding and a small garden out front, reflected her world, simple, lived in, and full of echoes from the past. Framed photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, each one a frozen moment in time. Her late husband, Arthur, smiled back at her from one of them, young, handsome, and full of promise. Beside his photo was one of their two children, David and Lillian, as children building a snowman. But the most cherished and painful photo of all was the one of Lillian as a grown woman. It was the last picture she'd ever taken of her daughter. Lillian, with her wild curls and sharp, defiant eyes, had been 24 in that photo, and the next day she was gone. No calls, no notes, no signs of foul play. Just gone. Vanished like a dream. Grief isn't something that fades, Margaret had learned. People tell you it will. They pat your shoulder, bring you casseroles, and say, "Time heals all wounds." But time didn't heal her. It just taught her how to live around the pain. Her days were shaped by an invisible wound, one that never quite closed. At first, she was consumed with the search. The first few years after Lillian's disappearance were a whirlwind of police reports, phone calls, and missing person posters tacked to streetlights. She hired a private investigator, emptied half her savings account, and spent nights scrolling through online forums for missing persons. She even went on a local TV station once, pleading for information with tears in her eyes. "If anyone knows where my daughter is, please tell me," she begged, her voice cracking like broken glass. But as the years dragged on and every lead went cold, the search slowed. Friends stopped asking. Family stopped bringing it up. Even her son David told her, "Mom, maybe it's time to accept that she's gone." But Margaret couldn't. She never would. Her relationship with David had become strained over the years, partly because of the loss and partly because David had moved on. He married, had kids of his own, and while he still visited her for Sunday dinners, there was an unspoken wedge between them. He believed Lillian was gone for good. Margaret didn't. She refused to admit it out loud, but every morning she still checked the mailbox. It was a ritual, a small gesture of hope she told no one about. She'd put on her old cardigan, slip on her sneakers, and walk down the short gravel path to the street. She'd open the mailbox with the same quiet anticipation, her heart giving a small jump at the sight of any letter that wasn't a bill or an advertisement. Every single day for 20 years, it was nothing. Flyers for pizza delivery, bank statements, and coupons for stores she never shopped at. The small flicker of hope would fade, and she'd carry her mail back into the house, her steps slower than when she'd left. She'd never admit it, but sometimes she whispered a small prayer on her way back. Just one sign, God. Just one sign. The house itself had become a shrine to memories. Her kitchen still had the old yellow wallpaper Lillian had hated. "It's so ugly, Mom," she said once, rolling her eyes as she helped wash the dishes. Margaret never changed it. The guest bedroom remained untouched, frozen in time like a museum exhibit. It had been Lillian's room once. The closet still had some of her old sweaters, and on the bedside table was a small ceramic jewelry box Margaret had bought her for her 18th birthday. She'd never had the heart to pack it away. Every once in a while, she'd walk in, sit on the edge of the bed, and just breathe, as if breathing in the air of that room might somehow bring her daughter back. But it never did. Over the years, the town began to see her as that poor woman who never moved on. They meant no harm, but small towns have long memories, and Margaret had become one of their stories. "Did you see her today?" Still checking the mailbox, they'd whisper to each other. "It's been 20 years. Margaret pretended not to hear them. Let them talk, she thought. They didn't know what it was like to be a mother whose child just vanished. They didn't understand the ache that lived in her chest every waking moment. They didn't know what it was like to live with the what-ifs every single day. What if she had been kinder to Lillian that day? What if she had let her be with that man, even if she didn't trust him? What if she had gone after her instead of letting her walk out the door? Margaret knew she'd never stop asking herself those questions. Then came that fateful day. It was an ordinary Tuesday, overcast skies, a chilly breeze hinting that winter was coming. Margaret woke up, made her coffee, and watched the clouds roll in through her kitchen window. It was one of those days where everything felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. She put on her cardigan and sneakers, feeling the familiar ache in her knees as she walked to the mailbox. Her hand hovered on the metal latch for a moment, as it always did, a small pause to prepare herself for disappointment. She opened it. Flyers. Junk mail. A grocery store coupon. Her heart began its usual slow descent, but then there it was. A postcard. Small. Worn. Yellowed on the edges like it had been traveling for a long time. There was no return address. No stamps she recognized. For a second, she didn't move, her eyes locked on it like it might disappear if she reached for it too quickly. Her fingers trembled as she took it out. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, heart racing as if she were a child sneaking into a candy jar. Her eyes scanned the back. The handwriting was messy but familiar. Margaret froze. Her eyes widened in shock, her fingers gripping the card so tightly that it crumpled at the edges. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the side of the mailbox to stay upright. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Her vision blurred with tears as she read it again, slower this time to be sure she wasn't dreaming. Mom, I'm sorry it's been so long. I never forgot you. Please don't forget me. Lillian. Her breath caught in her throat. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Her lips parted, and a shaky sob escaped her. No, it can't be, she gasped, wiping at her eyes as if clearing away the tears might change the words on the card. But they didn't change. They stayed right there in messy, imperfect handwriting, as real as the cold air biting at her skin. Her knees gave out entirely, and she sank to the ground, clutching the card to her chest. Tears streamed down her face as a wave of emotions hit her all at once. Disbelief, joy, terror, relief. Her whole body shook as she rocked back and forth, whispering, Lillian, oh baby girl, it's you. She sat there for a long time, letting the weight of it all settle over her. Her daughter was alive. After all these years, her heart, which had felt so cold for so long, felt warm again, like something had finally broken through the frost. But then came the questions. If Lillian was alive, where had she been all this time? Why hadn't she reached out sooner? What had happened to her? And why now? Her mind raced with possibilities. Was Lillian in danger? Was she hurt, alone, or in need of help? Margaret wiped her face with her sleeve and stared at the postcard again. The words stayed the same. She flipped it over, looking for clues. No return address. No city. No clue where it had come from. Her hands shook as she stood up slowly, her knees sore from the cold gravel. Her heart felt lighter, but heavier at the same time. She knew she had to tell David, but how could she explain it without sounding crazy? He would just say it was fake, wouldn't he? Mom, it's not her, he'd say. But Margaret knew. She knew in the way only a mother can. It was her daughter. It was Lillian. And if Lillian was out there, Margaret would do whatever it took to find her. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her hands folded tightly around the postcard like it was the most fragile, precious thing she'd ever held. The house around her felt different now. as if it had taken a deep breath after 20 years of stillness. Sunlight poured in through the window, catching the tiny flecks of dust floating in the air, but Margaret didn't see any of it. Her eyes were locked on the handwriting in front of her, every curve, every tilt of the letters. She traced them with her finger, her mind jumping between disbelief and absolute certainty. It was Lillian's handwriting. It had to be. No one else in the world looped their L's like that or made their M's look like little mountains. She remembered helping Lillian with her handwriting as a little girl. "Take your time," she'd said, gently guiding her hand on the page. Now, those same letters stared back at her, older, messier, but unmistakably hers. It was as if 20 years had been erased in an instant. Her daughter was alive. She wasn't crazy for hoping after all. But with that hope came something else, something darker. Creeping doubt. A whispering voice in the back of her mind that said, "What if this isn't what you think it is?" Her son David's voice echoed in her mind. He'd been telling her for years to stop looking for ghosts. "Mom, people disappear for a reason," he'd said during one of their more tense conversations. If she wanted to come back, she would have by now. Those words had stung so deeply that she'd stayed quiet for the rest of his visit. But now, looking at the postcard, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: defiance. "She's not a ghost, David. She's real." Her eyes flickered over the words again. "I never forgot you. Please don't forget me." That didn't sound like someone who wanted to stay away. It sounded like someone who needed help. Her chest tightened. Why did she write it like that? It wasn't just an apology. It was a plea. Something was wrong. Margaret's hand trembled as she set the card on the table, pressing it flat with her palm as if anchoring it in reality. Her eyes darted to the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. Should she call David? Should she tell him? No, not yet. He'd just say it was a scam or some cruel prank. She didn't want to hear that right now. She needed time to think, to believe in this moment for just a little while longer. Her eyes kept moving to the clock on the wall. It was 9:47 a.m., but the time didn't matter. The day had stopped moving the moment she read that postcard. The world outside her window seemed so normal. Cars driving by, Mrs. Porter walking her dog, birds chirping on the telephone line. How could everything look so ordinary when her entire world had just shifted? She pressed her fingers to her lips, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her chest felt tight, like her ribs were too small to contain the storm inside her. She needed air. She grabbed her coat off the hook, shoved the postcard into her coat pocket, and stepped outside. The crisp autumn air hit her face, sharp and cold, and for a moment she just stood there, breathing it in like it might clear her head. Her eyes scanned the street, as if Lillian might be walking toward her right now, arms open, ready to say, "Surprise, Mom." But the street was empty. Her feet carried her down the path, crunching on the gravel, and she didn't even realize where she was going until she was there. The same mailbox where she'd found the postcard. She opened it again, as if expecting more to appear. Empty. She crouched down and looked inside, twisting her head to see every corner, every inch of it. Her fingers ran along the metal walls, checking for anything that might have been left behind. Nothing. Her breath came out in a shaky puff of air. Her shoulders slumped as she stood up slowly, staring at the empty box as if it had betrayed her. She shook her head. "Don't be foolish, Margaret. It's not a magic mailbox." But wasn't it, though? Hadn't it just delivered the one thing she'd been praying for every morning for 20 years? She pulled the postcard from her pocket and stared at it again, like she needed to convince herself it was real. It was. It was so real that it hurt. Her mind started running in 100 directions at once. Where is she? Is she safe? Is she in trouble? Her eyes scanned the edges of the postcard, looking for any sign of where it had come from. There were smudges, faint creases, and a scuff on one side that looked like it had rubbed against something rough. But there were no stamps, no postmarks, no return address. Her heart jumped at that realization. How did it get here? She flipped it over, inspecting every inch like it was a crime scene. No stamps meant it hadn't been sent through the postal system. Someone had delivered it by hand. Her mind spiraled. Was it Lillian? Did she bring it herself? Was she here? Her eyes shot toward the street, scanning for anyone nearby. No one. Her heart pounded harder. She spun around, looking in every direction. If she was here, why didn't she knock on the door? She looked at her house, at the windows, half expecting to see someone peeking in from the other side. But it was just her empty house. She hugged herself, glancing at the street once more before walking back to the porch. Once inside, she locked the door behind her, something she hadn't done in years. Her fingers lingered on the deadbolt, twisting it back and forth like she wasn't sure if it would keep her safe. Her mind was still on the delivery of the postcard. It hadn't come in the mail. Someone had to have brought it here. Her throat felt dry. She needed tea. Her hands moved automatically, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove. The postcard sat on the table like it was watching her. Her eyes flickered toward it every few seconds. It sat there, plain as day, not moving, not changing, but it might as well have been on fire for how much it burned in her mind. Someone delivered it. They were here. While I was sleeping, they were here. She rubbed her arms, suddenly cold. Every noise in the house felt louder. The creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the whistle of the kettle starting to boil. As she poured the hot water into her teacup, her eyes stayed on the postcard. She'd seen enough crime shows to know what to do next. Evidence. You don't touch it. You keep it safe. She rummaged through her kitchen drawers until she found a small Ziploc bag. Carefully, like it was a butterfly's wing, she slid the postcard inside, sealing it shut. Her eyes scanned it once more, the words seared into her brain. I never forgot you. Please don't forget me. She sat at the kitchen table, her tea cooling beside her, and stared at the bag like it was some kind of sacred relic. What do I do now? She could call David, but she already knew how that would go. He'd roll his eyes, sigh like he was talking to a stubborn child, and tell her it wasn't real. He'd say it was fake, a prank. Scammers do this kind of thing all the time, Mom, he'd say. They want you to call them so they can ask for money. But this wasn't a scam. She knew that as surely as she knew her own name. She stared at the writing. It wasn't fake. It wasn't. Her fingers itched to call David, just to hear another voice, but she didn't. Not yet. She had something else in mind. She went to the hallway closet, pulled out an old shoebox, and opened it. Inside were papers from the private investigator she'd hired all those years ago. Notes, phone numbers, case files, and old newspaper clippings. It had been 18 years since she'd last opened that box. But as she flipped through the papers, she saw it, a name. Detective Howard Lang. Retired now, but she remembered his kindness. Maybe he'd remember me. Maybe he'd help me. Her eyes stayed on that name for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the phone, and finally she dialed. It rang 4 times. Her breath was shallow. Hello? An older man's voice answered. Mr. Lang, she said, her voice small but steady. It's Margaret Holloway. I think I just heard from my daughter. Margaret sat on the edge of her chair, gripping the phone so tightly that her fingers ached. Her breath was shallow, heart thudding in her chest like the ticking of that old wall clock behind her. She could hear the faint static on the line, the soft hum of Detective Howard Lang's breathing as he processed what she had just said. For a second, she feared he might not remember her. It had been so many years since they'd spoken, and life had a way of erasing you from people's memories. But then his voice came through, weathered but familiar, like an old friend she hadn't seen in a while. "Margaret Holloway," he said slowly, like he was pulling her name out of a fog. "I remember you. Your daughter went missing, right? Lillian, wasn't it?" Her eyes welled with tears at the sound of her daughter's name spoken out loud. People didn't say her name anymore. It was like she'd become some forbidden subject, an old tragedy people didn't want to revisit. Hearing it now felt like opening a door she'd nailed shut. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "Lillian. She's my daughter." Her fingers rubbed the edge of the Ziploc bag on the table, her eyes glued to the messy handwriting on the postcard inside. "She's alive, Mr. Lang. I think she's alive." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make Margaret wonder if he was about to hang up. But then he asked carefully, "Why do you think that, Margaret?" Her throat tightened as she tried to find the right words. She took a shaky breath, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I got a postcard this morning. It doesn't have a return address. No postmark. But it's from her, detective. I know it's from her. It's her handwriting. I know it anywhere." Her voice grew stronger with each word, like the certainty was being poured into her veins. "It says, 'Mom, I'm sorry it's been so long. I never forgot you. Please don't forget me.'" She blinked hard, willing herself to stay calm. "It's her, Mr. Lang. I know it's her." He sighed on the other end, and she recognized the sound. It was the sound people made when they were trying to be gentle with you, but didn't believe you. "Margaret, listen to me," he said, his tone careful and slow. "People can be cruel. It wouldn't be the first time someone's used a missing person case to play games with the family. Sometimes it's scammers looking for money. Sometimes it's just people looking for attention." "No," Margaret snapped, gripping the phone tighter. Her voice had the sharp edge of a mother who had been pushed too far. "No, Howard. It's her. I know my daughter's handwriting. You think I don't know my own child's writing after 24 years of helping her with her homework, her job applications, her Christmas cards? It's her." She took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Please, please listen to me." There was a long pause, and Margaret's heart felt like it was suspended in midair, waiting for his next words. Finally, Howard spoke again, this time with a little more weight. "All right, Margaret," he said, his tone softening. "I believe you. If you say it's her, then it's her. But if that postcard didn't come through the mail, then someone put it there by hand." His voice grew firmer, more focused. "That means they were at your house, Margaret. Recently. Maybe last night." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the room, eyes darting to the windows and the front door. She hadn't thought of it like that, not fully. The idea of someone standing outside her house in the dead of night while she was asleep made her chest tighten. Her eyes scanned the living room, every shadow suddenly feeling too large, every creak of the old house suddenly too loud. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table for support. You think she was here," she whispered, her voice so small she barely recognized it. "Maybe," Howard replied. "Or someone was." Silence hung between them, thick and heavy. Margaret's eyes locked on the front window, her heart racing. Her breath fogged up the air in front of her as if the house had suddenly dropped 20 degrees. She leaned forward, her voice hard now, as sharp as broken glass. "Then help me find her, Howard. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what I have to do. If she's out there, if she's close enough to leave me a postcard, I'm going to find her." Howard was quiet for a moment, but when he spoke, she could hear the resolve in his voice. "All right, Margaret. We'll do it right this time. Send me a photo of the postcard. Front and back." I'll check for prints, see if there's anything that can point us to where it came from." "Thank you, Howard," she said, her voice raw with relief. After hanging up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while, just staring at the phone, her heart still thudding hard in her chest. Her hands felt cold, but her mind was on fire. Every second that passed felt like a moment wasted. Her eyes flicked to the clock, 11:15 a.m. The sun was higher in the sky now, and golden light streamed through the window, making the dust motes shimmer like glitter. It was strange how the world looked so peaceful when inside, her whole world had been set on fire. She took a photo of the postcard, front and back, then sent it to Howard's number. She stared at her phone, watching the little message sent notification appear on the screen. It felt like releasing something into the world that couldn't be taken back. But as the seconds passed, Margaret began to feel something different. It wasn't relief. It was fear. If Lillian is close enough to deliver this postcard, why didn't she knock on the door? Her mind latched onto that question and wouldn't let it go. She thought about Lillian's last days before she disappeared. Her daughter had been stubborn, headstrong, but also brave. If she was in trouble, she wouldn't hide. Not unless she was afraid. Margaret felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Her eyes flickered toward the window, and for the first time in years, she pulled the curtains shut. Her fingers moved quickly, tugging at the fabric, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. She walked to the front door and checked the lock twice. Then she went to the back door and did the same. She felt a little foolish, like a child checking under the bed for monsters, but her gut told her it wasn't foolish at all. Someone had been here. She could feel it now, in her bones. Her eyes darted toward the hallway closet, where she kept an old baseball bat Arthur used to have. She opened the door and pulled it out, gripping it tightly in her hands. It felt strange to hold it after all these years, but it also felt right. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She darted back to the kitchen, grabbed it, and checked the screen. It was a message from Howard. "Got the photos. I'll run it by contact at the precinct, see if we can get prints. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know, Margaret." "I mean it." Her fingers hovered over the reply button, but she didn't type anything. She just stared at the message. "Don't open the door for anyone you don't know." Her eyes flickered toward the front door, her breath shallow and sharp. She was gripping the phone so tightly that her fingers turned white. She turned off the ringer and set it on the table. The world outside was quiet. Too quiet. She didn't hear the birds anymore. She didn't hear the sound of cars on the street. Her ears strained, listening for anything, footsteps, breathing, movement. But all she heard was the steady ticking of the wall clock behind her. She moved to the window, keeping her head low as she peeked through the curtain. Across the street, she spotted Mrs. Porter walking her dog. But further down the road, on the opposite sidewalk, a man stood still. Not walking, just standing there, looking toward her house. Her heart stopped. She couldn't make out his face, but she could see his posture, head tilted, body rigid. Her fingers tightened around a baseball bat. She whispered to herself, "It's nothing. It's nothing." But deep down, she knew it wasn't nothing. Margaret didn't know how long she stood at the window, peeking through the narrow slit in the curtains, her breath shallow, her heart a relentless drumbeat in her chest. The man hadn't moved. Not a step. Not a shift in his weight. He just stood there on the far side of the street like a statue. From this distance, she couldn't see his face clearly, but she didn't need to. She felt it. The weight of his stare pressed against her house like an unseen hand. Her grip on the baseball bat tightened, her palms slick with sweat. She squinted, trying to make out his features. Was he young? Old? Tall? Short? Her eyes caught on his jacket, dark green, the kind you'd see hunters wear. She knew that color. She'd seen it before, but where? Her mind flickered with flashes of old memories, sharp and fragmented like broken glass. Her body moved before her mind did. She backed away from the window slowly, careful not to disturb the curtains. Her heart told her to run, to bolt every door, to hide under her bed like a child. But she wasn't a child. She was a mother. And if her daughter was out there, she had to be brave. She moved toward the front door, her socked feet silent against the hardwood. She checked the deadbolt, twisted it twice just to be sure, and slid the chain lock into place. Her fingers hovered over the lock for a moment longer than necessary. Who is he? Why is he just standing there? Her mind conjured possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it him? Was it Lillian's old boyfriend? The one she'd warned her daughter about so many years ago. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut for a second, trying to shake off the image of his face. She could still see it, even after all these years. Slick black hair, a crooked grin that never quite reached his eyes, and that way he leaned against door frames like he owned them. Marcus. She never trusted him. She'd said so 100 times to Lillian, but her daughter had been too stubborn, too wild-hearted to listen. "You're wrong about him, Mom," Lillian had said, eyes flashing with defiance. "He's not like that. You just don't understand." But Margaret had understood. She'd seen men like him before, men who smiled with their teeth but never their eyes. Men who knew how to twist a woman's heart into something soft and pliable, something they could shape for their own benefit. The memory hit her like a gut punch. Could it be him? No, that wasn't possible. He'd be older now, too old to be standing in the street like some kind of phantom from the past. People like him didn't wait in shadows. They acted. They struck. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Knock, knock, knock. Her body jolted as if struck by lightning. She clutched the baseball bat so tightly that her fingers ached. Her eyes darted to the door. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow and uneven. For a moment, all she could hear was the echo of the knock reverberating through the house like a bell. Her hand shook, and she felt a sudden rush of warmth in her face. "Don't open it. Don't open it. Don't open it." Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced over at it, her nerves already frayed. It was a message from Detective Lang. "Don't answer the door unless you know who it is." Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the front door again. Another knock, harder this time. Her legs felt like lead, but somehow she moved toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate. "Don't open it. Look through the peephole. Look first." Her mind repeated the instructions like a mantra. She leaned in slowly, holding her breath. The cold metal of the peephole pressed against her eye. Her breath hitched. It wasn't the man from the street. It was a woman. A young woman. Her hoodie was pulled up over her head, shielding part of her face, but Margaret could see her nose, her chin, and the slight tremble in her lips. Her heart leapt into her throat, a mix of hope and fear so powerful it made her knees weak. Lillian? No, it couldn't be. Lillian would be older now, in her 40s. This woman was younger. Early 20s, maybe. Her skin was pale, and her eyes darted left and right like a trapped animal. She didn't look threatening. She looked scared. Margaret's breath fogged up the peephole. She pulled back, her mind racing. Do I open it? She glanced at her phone, reading Detective Lang's message again. Her eyes flickered back to the door. She's just a girl. She looked scared. Her heart squeezed with something she hadn't felt in a long time, compassion. What if she needs help? What if she's running from something? Her fingers hovered over the chain lock. Another knock, lighter this time. Desperate, the girl's voice cracked through the door. "Please," she said, her voice small but clear. "Please, I just need to talk to you." Margaret's breath came faster. She bit her lip, glancing toward the phone on the table. She could call Lang, but what would she say? "There's a girl at my door." She looked scared. Would he tell her to turn her away? To leave her out there in the cold? She shook her head. "I can't do that. I can't." Her fingers slowly undid the chain lock. She unlocked the deadbolt but kept her hand on the knob, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice strong but not unkind. "What do you want?" A pause. Silence. Margaret pressed her ear against the door. She could hear the girl breathing, fast and shallow. "I'm a friend," the girl said, her voice cracking. "Please, I don't have anywhere else to go. I just need to talk." Margaret's fingers curled around a knob, hesitating. "Don't do it, Margaret. Don't do it." But something inside her wouldn't let go. Something she couldn't name. Her eyes flickered to the window. The man was gone. The street was empty. Her fingers turned the knob slowly. She cracked the door open an inch, just enough to see the girl's face fully now. She looked up at Margaret with wide, frightened eyes. Her face was young but tired, like someone who'd lived too much life too quickly. "Please," the girl said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're looking for me." Margaret's heart squeezed. "Who's looking for you?" She wanted to ask, but something stopped her. Her eyes darted up and down the street. Still empty. Still quiet. She looked back at the girl. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying for hours. Margaret opened the door a little wider. Just a little more. Just enough. "Who's looking for you, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but firm. The girl didn't answer. Her eyes filled with tears, and she bit her lips so hard that Margaret worried she might bleed. She reached up and pulled down her hood, revealing long, tangled brown hair. Something about the gesture stirred something deep inside Margaret. Something old, something familiar. Her breath caught in her throat. That hair, that face. Her eyes widened as she stared at the girl's face. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But there it was, as clear as the day her daughter left. The same shape of the eyes. The same sharp cheekbones. The same mouth that used to pout when she didn't get her way. Lillian. Margaret's voice broke like glass. The girl's eyes filled with tears, her whole body shaking with quiet sobs. Her shoulders trembled, and she wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. She nodded slowly, her lips quivering as she whispered the word Margaret had been waiting 20 years to hear. "Mom." Margaret's knees buckled, and she gripped the doorframe for support. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "It's you. It's really you." Lillian stepped forward, tears falling freely now. She reached out her hand, and Margaret reached back. Their fingers touched, cold against warm. But then, over Lillian's shoulder, Margaret saw something that froze her blood. The man in the green jacket. He was back, standing at the end of the street. This time, he was moving toward them. "Lillian," Margaret gasped, yanking her daughter inside and slamming the door shut. Her hands moved faster than they had in years, locking every lock, every chain, every latch. Her breath came in gasps. Who was he, Lillian? Her daughter's eyes darted toward the window, fear consuming her face. "Mom," she whispered, her voice like a broken prayer. "I made a mistake." Margaret's heart felt like it was on the verge of collapse. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting from the window to her daughter, and back to the window again. The man in the green jacket was closer now. Not running, just walking, slow, deliberate, like he knew there was no need to rush. The kind of walk that people did when they knew they had control of the situation. Margaret gripped Lillian's wrist tightly, dragging her away from the door and into the living room. Her eyes flickered to the front window. She moved quickly, yanking the curtains closed so hard that the curtain rod rattled against the wall. Her hands moved with the urgency of a woman who had been here before, protecting her home, her family, her daughter. "Sit," Margaret ordered, pointing to the couch. Her voice was sharp, but there was love in it too. The kind of love that sounds like anger, because it's laced with fear. Lillian sat without question, her eyes darting toward the front door like she expected it to burst open at any moment. Her hands shook, fingers twitching like she wanted to grab something, but didn't know what. Margaret grabbed the baseball bat from the kitchen and stood in front of her daughter like a soldier guarding the gates. Her hands were steady now. Fear had its place, but not in this moment. Not when her child needed her. "Talk to me, Lillian," Margaret said, her eyes locked on the door. Her voice was firm, steady, like a mother who had no time for lies. "Who is he? Why is he here?" Lillian ran her hands through her tangled hair, breathing fast like she'd just run a marathon. Her lips quivered, and her eyes darted to the window before settling on her mother. "I didn't know he'd follow me," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I thought I lost him, Mom. I swear I thought I lost him." Her hands went to her face, fingers pressing into her eyes like she was trying to stop herself from crying. "I didn't think he'd find me here." "Who?" Margaret asked again, louder this time. She knelt in front of Lillian, her eyes searching her daughter's face for something. Truth, lies, fear, anything that would help her understand. "Who is he, Lillian? Tell me the truth, baby girl. No more running. No more secrets." Lillian's breath hitched, and for a moment, she just sat there silent, her fingers trembling against her knees. Her eyes flickered up to meet Margaret's, and in that moment, Margaret saw it. That look she hadn't seen since Lillian was a child caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. The way her eyes would lower, lips pressed into a hard line, shame settling into her shoulders like a weight she couldn't lift. Margaret knew that look better than she knew her own reflection. "Mom," Lillian whispered, tears spilling down her face. Her voice cracked, and her hands gripped her hair so tightly that Margaret worried she might pull it out. "I owe him money." She choked on a sob, covering her face with her hands. "I owe him so much money." Margaret's eyes widened, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "No, not this. Anything but this." Her stomach sank like a stone, and her chest burned with a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. "What do you mean, owe him money?" Her voice was tight, controlled, but there was a sharp edge to it, the edge of a mother on the brink of breaking. Lillian shook her head, her fingers tugging at her hair. "It's not like that, Mom. I didn't know it would get this bad." Her words tumbled out fast, her voice rising with panic. "I thought it was just a loan. Just a small loan. I needed it for rent, and he said it would be quick. He said it was easy. No paperwork, no banks, just cash. I just needed time to get back on my feet." Her hands dropped to her lap, her fingers curling into fists. "But it wasn't like that, Mom. It wasn't like that at all." Margaret felt her heart break in a way it hadn't broken in 20 years. She stood slowly, her gaze fixed on her daughter like she was seeing her for the first time. Her fingers pressed against her own lips, as if holding in a scream. Her eyes closed tightly, her mind racing. "Lillian, what did you do?" "Loan sharks," Margaret muttered, her voice low, her eyes still closed. "You went to loan sharks, didn't you?" Her eyes snapped open, sharp as glass. She stared at Lillian, her gaze so piercing that it made Lillian flinch. "Tell me I'm wrong." But Lillian didn't. Her silence was the only answer Margaret needed. "You brought them here," Margaret hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body trembling with it. "You brought them to my house." "My house, Lillian." She pointed toward the front door, her finger like a blade. "That man out there, is that who you owe?" Lillian nodded quickly, her eyes wild with fear. "I didn't know he'd follow me, Mom. I swear I didn't know." Her voice cracked into a sob, her shoulders shaking with every breath. "I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could get away. I thought I could." She stopped, her hands covering her face again. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Margaret shook her head slowly, her breathing shallow but steady. Her mind was calculating now, moving like clockwork, cold and sharp. She walked to the kitchen, her steps slow, deliberate. She opened the drawer, pulled out her phone, and scrolled to Detective Lang's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. No, not yet. Her eyes flickered toward the window. The man in the green jacket was gone. Her breath hitched. "Lillian," she said, her voice so low and steady that it didn't sound like her own. "Where did he go?" Lillian's head snapped up, her face pale as paper. "What do you mean?" Margaret's eyes stayed on the window. "He's not out there anymore." "Where did he go?" Her fingers tightened on the phone, but she didn't call yet. Instead, she moved toward the back door, baseball bat in hand. Her eyes scanned the backyard, watching for any movement, any shift of the shadows. Nothing. But that didn't mean he wasn't there. They never leave, not really. They wait. They always wait. Her ears strained for every sound. The refrigerator's hum, the slow creak of the house settling, her own breath, shallow and uneven. Then, just barely, she heard it. A soft creak. Not from the backyard. Not from the front porch. It came from behind her. Inside, her heart stopped. Slowly, she turned her head toward the hallway. Her eyes locked on the shadow stretching across the floor. It moved. Not fast. Not slow. Steady. The shadow of a man walking toward the living room. Her mind snapped into focus. "Lillian," she said quietly, her eyes locked on the shadow. "Get up." "Mom, what?" "Get up," Margaret said again, her voice sharper this time. She raised the baseball bat slowly, her breath coming in slow, measured beats. "Go to the kitchen. Lock yourself in the pantry." Lillian didn't ask questions. She moved quickly, her eyes filled with terror. Margaret could hear her footsteps rushing to the kitchen, the soft creak of the pantry door opening, the sound of it locking from the inside. "Good girl." Margaret stayed perfectly still, her eyes on the shadow. It stopped moving. "Don't be stupid," a man's voice said from the hallway, deep and calm like he'd done this 100 times before. "You know how this ends, lady. Open the door, and I walk away." Margaret tilted her head slowly, her lips curling into a smile that had no warmth in it at all. She gripped the bat tighter, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the hallway. "Son," she said, her voice cool as ice. "You picked the wrong house." Silence. Then, slowly, the shadow moved forward. Margaret's fingers gripped the baseball bat so tightly that she could feel the grain of the wood pressing into her palms. Her breathing slowed, her eyes locked on the hallway. The shadow moved closer, stretching long and thin against the floor as if it belonged to something much bigger than a man. Her heart was no longer wild in her chest. It had gone cold, steady, calculating. She could hear the faint shuffle of his footsteps on the hardwood. Whoever he wasn't rushing. He wasn't afraid. He was walking with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you have the upper hand. But Margaret knew something he didn't. He wasn't the only one who knew how to wait. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen where Lillian had locked herself in the pantry. Good girl. Stay put. Her gaze returned to the hallway, her body still as stone, her muscles coiled and ready. She could feel every inch of the bat in her hands. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough. Enough to make someone think twice. Let him come closer. Just a little closer. Her eyes never left the hallway. She could see his legs now. Cargo pants. Heavy boots. The kind of boots that made noise on hardwood if you didn't walk carefully. He didn't care about noise. No, this man wanted her to know he was coming. You're a stubborn old lady. The man's voice echoed down the hall, smooth and slow like a man enjoying the sound of his own words. It had the kind of tone that was used to getting its way. Didn't your daughter tell you? I'm not the kind of guy you say no to. Margaret didn't respond. She knew better. Predators liked the sound of their own voices, and the more they talked, the more they revealed. She stayed quiet, her eyes sharp as glass, her breath controlled and slow. Don't make this hard, Grandma, he said, stepping fully into the room now. Her eyes swept over him in a second. Dark green jacket, hood down, unshaven face, mid-40s, thick build, eyes that scanned the room like a predator looking for prey. He had that lean, hungry look she'd seen in men like him before. She knew it well. It was the look of a man who had never learned how to earn what he wanted, only how to take it. He glanced at her, his eyes flicking to the baseball bat, then to the window, then back to her. You really gonna swing that thing at me, old lady? He chuckled, the sound low and ugly. Come on now. You're smarter than that. You let me get what I came for, and I walk out. Simple. Her eyes didn't blink. Not once. She tilted her head slowly, her face as still as stone. There's the door, she said quietly, nodding toward it with her chin. Her voice was cold as a December morning. Take your exit while you still have legs to walk on. He let out a laugh sharp and short, like she'd told him a joke he wasn't expecting. He licked his teeth, grinning wide now. His eyes darted around the room, scanning for something, and Margaret knew what it was. Lillian. He's looking for her. Your daughter owes me, he said, pointing one finger at her like he was scolding a child. You think I'm just going to walk away from that? He tapped his temple with 2 fingers. I'm not stupid, lady. I know she's here. I saw her come in. So I'll tell you what, you give her to me, and I forget this whole thing ever happened. You get to keep your pretty little house. Everybody wins. He spread his arms wide like he was offering a gift. Sound fair? Fair, Margaret repeated, tasting the word like it was poison on her tongue. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. No, I don't think that's the word you're looking for, son. Her eyes locked on his face, and in that moment, something changed. Her grip on the bat shifted. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was something else. His grin faltered just a little. His eyes narrowed. He tilted his head like he was trying to figure her out. You think I'm playing with you, huh? He said, his tone lower now, sharper. He took one step forward. You think this is a game, Grandma? No, Margaret said, her voice calm as the ocean before a storm. Her fingers flexed around the bat's handle, and her eyes followed his every movement. But you're about to learn something new today. His eyes flickered with something she recognized. Doubt. It was small, but it was there. He saw it in her eyes. The stillness. The certainty. He wasn't looking at a frail old woman anymore. He was looking at something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't care about his threats. She saw it in his face, that flicker of hesitation that comes right before a man realizes he's made a mistake. "Last chance," she said softly, her voice so quiet it made him lean forward just a bit to hear her. "Leave." He hesitated. Then he stepped forward fast, his hand reaching for her wrist. Margaret moved before she even thought about it. The swing was smooth, sharp, and fast. The bat cut through the air with a whistle and hit him square in the side of the knee. Crack. He let out a roar of pain and dropped like a sack of bricks, his hands clutching his leg. He twisted on the floor, his face contorted in pain, teeth bared in a snarl. "Oh, you crazy old..." Before he could finish, Margaret raised the bat again. She wasn't afraid anymore. Her breath was steady, her heart calm. She stood over him, her eyes hard as stone, the bat raised high. His eyes went wide with panic now. Wait, he gasped, holding up his hands. Don't. You're gonna crawl out of here," she said, her voice steady and sharp as steel. "And if I see you again, if I even hear about you looking for Lillian, I won't stop at your knee." She leaned down, her eyes locking with his. "Do you understand me, boy?" He nodded quickly, his face twisted in pain. Yeah, I got it. His breath came fast and shallow, his eyes darting toward the door. I'm gone. Margaret didn't move. She watched him squirm, clutching his knee as he dragged himself toward the door. She stayed right where she was, eyes on him like a hawk watching a rabbit. Her heart stayed steady, her breathing slow. When he reached the door, he looked back at her, one last desperate look of hatred in his eyes. She raised the bat an inch higher, and he scrambled out the door like a snake slithering back into the woods. The door shut behind him. She locked it. This time, she did it slow, deliberate, her fingers twisting the lock with satisfaction. The weight in her chest lifted. "Mom." Lillian's voice came from behind her. It was small, shaky, like a little girl calling for her mother in the dark. Margaret turned, and for the first time in 20 years, she saw her daughter clearly. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and wide. She looked so much like she did at 16, standing in the kitchen after sneaking out past curfew. All that stubbornness gone, replaced with fear and regret. Margaret lowered the bat slowly, leaning it against the wall. She walked toward Lillian, her arms opening wide. "Come here, baby girl," she whispered. Lillian didn't hesitate. She ran to her mother, burying her face in her chest, her arms clutching her like she was a child again. Margaret held her tight, running her fingers through her hair, rocking her gently. No words, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a mother holding her child. "It's okay," Margaret whispered, kissing the top of her head. "It's okay, baby. You're home." For the first time in 20 years, it felt true. Tears streamed down Lillian's face as she clung to her mother, her whole body trembling. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she sobbed, her voice muffled in Margaret's sweater. "I'm so sorry." "I know, baby," Margaret said, her own tears falling now. Her eyes closed as she held her daughter close. "I know." They stayed like that for a long time. The weight of 20 years lifted in that single moment. Not everything was fixed. Not everything was healed. But for the first time in 2 decades, it felt like they could finally begin again. Then,